In this video, we're going to talk about wildfire. And as I'm sitting here making this video, fires are still burning across California, Oregon, and Washington in one of the worst fire seasons the West Coast of the United States has ever seen. President Trump says that this is a result of poor forest management. Other people say this is an example of climate change. And part of what we're going to do in this video is try to untangle some of these two factors between management and climate, and also ask the question of how much our own decisions about development are playing a role in these types of events. So let's jump right in. So here's what we want to do in this video. So first, we want to understand and explain how fire influences forest ecosystems and why this is such a natural part of the way that these systems work. Secondly, we need to take a look so that you're able to describe how changes in management can influence fire frequency and behavior. This is a crucial factor in what's going on in wildfire in the United States. And lastly, you should be able to explain how climate change interacts with these sorts of changes in forest management to create a higher risk of fire in forests. There's no question that climate is involved here, but it is a little more complicated than just saying this is all climate change. So let's go forward with these three objectives. So here's the first key point. Fire is a natural part of forest and grassland ecosystems. And in fact, fire is critical to how these communities are structured and how these ecosystems actually function. Just a couple of examples here. Many pine cones are serotinous, which means that they only release their seeds after a trigger event, which is often fire. And without that trigger event, the trees actually don't reproduce. So for species like pine, the fire event is actually what allows the forest to regrow. There's other things that happens with fire. So fires open up canopies to light, which then allows other species to move in and grow. That can increase the diversity of the forest. Fires also kill off older trees and reduce forest density. And in part because that changes the age structure of the forest, so it's more diversified with both old trees and young trees, that can also reduce the likelihood of disease spread. So take home point, without fire, these forests and grasslands would look really, really different, and it's actually part of how these systems are supposed to function. If you remember from an earlier video on population and communities, there is this notion of disturbance in ecosystems and plant communities. A disturbance is an event that resets a community structure. Disturbances happen naturally, as we've talked about in other videos. They also tend to happen at semi-regular or relatively regular intervals. So fire is a great example of this. If we look at this map of the United States, what we're looking at is actually the estimated fire frequency for the historic period of 1960 to 1850. That's when population densities in the United States were much lower than they are now. So this is sort of the natural fire frequency. So colors in red, say the darkest red down in central and eastern Texas, is a fire return interval of about 2 years. The other oranges are 2 to 4 or 4 to 6 years or 6 to 8 years. Those are grassland fires. Grasslands are adapted and accustomed to very frequent fires. They burn quickly, they burn to the ground, and the grasses resprout. So 2 to 6 years. If you go into the yellow periods, you're looking at 12, 14, 16 years. There you see a lot of the Midwestern forests up around the Great Lakes. You see some of the Northeastern forests, and you see some of the forests in the Rocky Mountains and the Intermountain West. The greens are around 20 years, the blues are around 30 to 40 years, and the purples, which would be your least frequent fires, are on the order of 75 to 200 years. Places where fire rarely occurs. The main point here is that fire is very frequent in the grasslands. It's less frequent, but still quite frequent in drier forests, like those along the foothills of the Rocky Mountains or in the Intermountain West. And it's less frequent in wet forests, like some places in the Pacific Northwest. Overall, what we see from this map is that we should always expect fire to occur. It's just a question of how frequently that fire would occur under natural conditions. Now, as we said in the prior slide, fires change forests. They open up patches, diversify age structure, increase ecosystem diversity, all these other sort of things that are really important for how ecosystems work. The other thing is that when forests burn, they're less likely to burn again for a period of time. So if a fire burns on average every 50 years, it'll be 50 years from the last fire to the next fire. So as long as you maintain a regular fire frequency, you're going to see that frequency continue. If you do something, say, to suppress fire, which we're going to talk about in a second, then you may increase the interval between the last fire and the next fire, but you probably also increase the area that's going to burn because there's a lot of area sitting there that's just ready to go. All right, so here's the thing. So when people say that management is responsible or partially responsible for the increase in fires in the United States, there is some truth to this because the way that the United States has managed its forests has changed dramatically over time. If you remember Smokey the Bear, or if you've seen images of Smokey the Bear, what did Smokey do? He put out fires and prevented fires. And this is part of a long history of forest management in the United States. It began in the late 1800s when the U.S. began setting aside natural forests. The U.S. Forest Service was created in 1905. And a big point of the creation of the Forest Service and the setting aside of these areas was to produce timber. Well, you can't produce timber if the forest burned down. And in 1910, there was a massive series of fires in Montana, Washington, and Idaho that burned 3 million acres in just a couple days. And that led to fire suppression becoming a core part of the way that the U.S. managed its national forests. And that means preventing fires, thus Smokey, asking us to prevent fires, and then trying to put out fires quickly. So don't let them burn once they get started. Now, the problem is that this changes the way the forests work, and it also makes it more likely that the fires are bigger when they actually happen. So in the 1970s, the policy started to change, and a new policy called Let Burn was introduced. Now, this sounds good. If a fire starts, let it burn, let it run through the system, and let it be sort of a natural ecological process. In practice, it's really hard because fires tend to burn into places where people live, destroy property, put people at risk. So a great idea, hard to actually implement. From 1990 to the present, we've faced a number of different issues. For example, management on forest lands, which are mostly federal and not state, is heavily restricted by budgets. So we can say we want to manage the forest, but if there's no money in the federal budget to do it, then we can't do it. It's also disruptive. So if you're going to selectively log a forest or you're going to do a controlled burn, you may have opposition from surrounding communities and sometimes environmental groups to those sorts of activities. So from 1990 to present, we've been in the cycle of debate about whether or not we should and how we should manage these forests. There's a third issue that we have to think about when we talk about wildfires and specifically wildfire impacts. And that is the massive growth that we have seen in the United States of housing developments in high-risk areas. Those include places like coastal California, many parts of central California, many parts of the Intermountain West, extending out to Colorado, and large areas of the Southeast. The issue here is that it's twofold. One is that fuel reduction and all of these things like selective logging or prescribed fires is always going to be more challenging when there are housing areas nearby. The second is that these areas, which are called the wildland-urban interface, which is really this development that occurs at the edge of urban and natural settings, is very, very high risk. You've got a lot of flammable vegetation right next to a lot of flammable housing, and prevention of fire or suppression or fighting a fire after an event becomes much more challenging and the risks become much larger. And that's partially just simply due to people choosing to move into these areas and creating then this potential for large impacts to occur when a fire does burn. If we look around the United States and ask where the major issues are, it's in the wildland-urban interface, and that interface occurs across the country. You can see on this map, it's the orange and the red areas that are really the major points of concern. A lot of those are in the southeastern U.S. and the East Coast. So let's come back to that in a second. You can see other areas along the Front Range of Colorado. You see a little red dot around Denver and Colorado Springs, and you can see a lot running up and down the west coast of the United States in California, Oregon, and Washington. Most of those in places that are currently in 2020 burning. All right, so if you look across the United States like this, you've got two things. One is you've got where this map is showing us where the vegetation and the housing co-occur. What it's not showing us is actually what we saw on that earlier map, is where forests most likely to burn. And they tend to burn more frequently in the western United States. And in recent years, the western United States has faced some pretty severe droughts that have really stressed those systems and made them at higher risk of fire. So despite the sort of national map, the concern at the moment tends to be more skewed to the western U.S., although the southeastern U.S. also faces really significant risks moving forward. This map comes from a publication in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2019, and the lead author and other authors are actually from University of Colorado at Boulder. Now, this paper makes a number of different points. So the first one is if we look at this map, we can see red and we can see orange and we can see gray. So the red is where wildfires have occurred inside the 2010 mapping of the wildland-urban interface. The orange show where the wildfires occurred outside that mapping. And the gray shows the actual wildland-urban interface. So the red areas are the ones where we're seeing fires occur in places where there is also heavy housing density. And the real issue in these locations is that when you're fighting a fire in the wildland-urban interface, you can't just let it burn. Remember that idea of the new U.S. policy was to let fires burn. Well, you can't do that if there are houses everywhere. So those fires have to be suppressed. And that can put firefighters at risk. It's very expensive, and it's often very hard, as we're seeing this year in 2020. For obvious reasons, the impact of fire on life and property are much higher if they're co-occurring, if your fire is occurring in the same place where you have housing. The other one issue is that the likelihood of ignition increases when you have more people around. We'll talk about that on the next slide. So in a minute, I'm going to show you a computer simulation of the fire that's called the Campfire. So let me tell you about that campfire, and then I'll tell you about the simulation, and then we'll actually look at the way that this fire occurred back in 2018. So this was November 8th, 2018, and the fire started with a faulty power line. This has created a subsequent set of legal challenges to PG&E, the electric company in California, led to that company filing for bankruptcy. So there's been an enormous fallout from this fire. Pretty amazing statistics. 85 civilian fatalities, 5 firefighters died fighting this fire. It was 153,000 acres plus. Destroyed over 18,000 structures, with most of that occurring in the first 4 hours of the fire. This is an extraordinarily destructive event. Total cost of the fire estimated over $16 billion. It was the most costly natural disaster in 2018. It occurred during an incredibly dry fall in California during a period with really high winds. That's a background. What you're going to look at is a computer simulation model. These models are used to try to represent the interaction between fire and the physical environment. That includes winds, topography, vegetation density, moisture content, all the factors that lead to fire spread. So let's take a look and see what this fire looked like. So in this simulation, we see this fire ignition occur about 6:55 a.m. You can watch the clock spin here, but this is the actual spread of the fire. You can see the wind are the arrows that are shown on here, and this fire went down these steep gullies through pine forest terrain straight into the town of Paradise, where most of the structures and loss of life occurred, and it occurred incredibly quickly, 4 hours. There's no way to respond to a fire like this that's occurring in this type of time frame. And you can see how quickly it spread down this setting and how much of a role the winds probably played in this event. This now brings us to the last question that we want to look at in this video, and that's climate change. So when you think about climate change and the way it affects fires, it's good to just back up and ask, what does it take to light a fire and then to grow a fire? So starting a fire requires an ignition source. That's usually going to be lightning or some kind of human activity, like we just saw with the power line on the campfire. It requires a fuel source, and that fuel source has density. So an overgrown forest, a forest that has had fire suppressed for many years is going to spread more quickly than one that has been thinned. And it requires moisture, and that's a key factor. It's yellow because that's affected by climate change. We'll talk about that. The rate of fire growth depends on fuel distribution, again, sort of density and where the forests are, temperature and moisture at the time and prior to the event, winds, as we saw in that last video, and then whatever suppression efforts are available for the fire after it starts. So in this paper, which was published in 2016, again in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, the authors analyzed the effect of anthropogenic or human-caused climate change on wildfire. And the core relationship that they found is a pretty straightforward one. Basically, as fuels get drier and drier, they're more likely to burn. If you try to light a wet log on fire, it won't work. If you try to light a dry log on fire, it will. And that's the basic concept right here. So these two researchers analyzed what would have happened with or without observed human climate change. That's a number that we can actually figure out. And I'm going to use our own words right here to report their results. They said anthropogenic climate change accounted for about 55% of the observed increases in fuel aridity from 1979 to 2015 across western U.S. forests. So a little over half of the fuels that are the drier fuels that we've seen over the last couple decades is coming from climate change. The other part is coming from natural climate variability. So it's about 50-50. But take-home message, about half of the observed increase in aridity is going to be from human-caused climate change. They go on then to say that we estimate that human-caused climate change contributed to an additional 4.2 million hectares of forest fire during the 1984 to 2015 period. It's about double the forest fire area expected in the absence of human-caused climate change. So about half of the aridity increase is from human-caused climate change, and about half of the total fire area that occurred between 1984 and 2015 was a result of climate change. This is one study, but there are many other studies that make exactly the same point. So is fire the result of climate change? Partially, yes. Is it the result of management? Partially, yes. Do we have to deal with both of these things if we want to address fire? Yes. And we also have to think hard about where we're building houses and how those housing areas are going to interact with the potential for fire. So the big take-home points from this video then is that fire is a natural part of how forests and grasslands function. It is, and it's always going to be present in these systems, and we have to figure out how to live with that and manage it. Does management matter? Yes. Fuel suppression in the United States has greatly increased the risk of fire in many forests. And the combination in recent years of a lack of resources, sometimes opposition to forest management, and other community or governmental or economic factors has increased the risk of fire in many settings. The other thing is that development is also increasing the risk that fire has impacts on property and life. Climate change, then, is making the wildland fire situation worse. Higher temperatures make fuels drier, even if you don't have an actual drought. And it increases the likelihood of large fires. If you actually have a drought, and some droughts are seemingly related to climate change, that makes the situation even worse. So how do you address it? You deal with climate, you deal with management, and you deal with housing development. Those are the only things that we can do to reduce the impacts of fire on our communities.